why Karzai has repeatedly hammered Obama for the policies that he has implemented with the groups present and made the situation much worse. It was originally a 5-year plan, and to this day, we still see troops present. That's why I have two issues. Even if my member did a pretty good job of telling you that this wasn't a debate about foreign policy, but fine, we will engage in them because they just don't want to go away. And we think that the whole convention of government's case was based on the idea of the best economic policies implemented. That's the first issue about the baggage that negotiating with these certain types of groups bring. And the second issue will be about what is the best interest for the South African countries and how they can properly develop. We think that the whole idea that the opening government and even closing government was telling us that they would somehow find aid to bring to Africa. We think that the aid you're speaking of is non-existent. That's why there are countries who are struggling to pay off their debt with the IMF, and they can barely resurrect themselves. So unless you can find aid from heaven, we don't think that they can necessarily invest in these South African countries. And then they tell us that, well, in some cases, it can only be the US. We think that that's particularly because of the US that Europe is also falling. That's why you had European markets that invested in US firms. So as soon as the US financial system collapsed, it was the ticking time bomb that also affected or was a particular reason for the Euro banks that collapsed. And we think that this plays an important role because they told us that there are mutual interests when you engage with other banks from South Africa. So if you have one bank that is potentially falling and you share liquidity between these two banks, there's also a greater chance of risk spreading to these developing African countries. And we think when you have greater risk, especially because they're developing, when financial burden strikes, it becomes much harder for them to recover and it brings down even more countries. Rather in the case of China, when they told us that, well, the East sometimes does not, or the East also went through the financial crisis, yes, and the East has properly recovered. We pointed to the 1997 crisis where the East was able to rise. That's why you have countries like China. Well, what about in the case of Japan, for example? We think that Japan's economy in a way is slow, but it is still coping with the current economic policies present, rather than the US that is struggling to give people jobs. And we point you to Europe. So we think on that level, on the level of being able to cope with financial crisis that can happen, we should give the policies to East. Now, we think on the whole idea of foreign policies, that it would be much better to engage with the West because they are saviors. Then Merrill told us that it wasn't only because of colonialism that the West hated, that Robert Mugabe hates the West. We think that no, this can be looked at as two sides, but the mere reason that Robert Mugabe refused to go out or refused to accept that elections happened was because the party was supported by the US groups. And we point you to the case of Somalia, where she told us that, well, because the pirates, the US can somehow kill the pirates off. We think that this isn't true because there's a particular faction in Somalia that is related to Al-Qaeda. So we think that when you have the US trying to play a role in these types of countries, we think that Al-Qaeda or any terrorist group that thinks of the US or any Al-Qaeda group that is in relation will not try to negotiate with countries related to the US. We think that what they're telling us is that Al-Qaeda can somehow be best friends with the US, which is something that isn't going to happen. And we think that the whole idea of China being in these particular countries is much better because you allow less chances of lethal force to be used. And we point you to the example of Sudan, when China played an important role to make sure that they could have possible government policies implemented properly to attain stability. That's why the North didn't attack the West for its oil reserves, because of the peacekeeping troops that China asked Sudan to that China encouraged Sudan to allow inside. And we think that the West wouldn't have accomplished this, particularly because al-Bashir leads the West for the very reasons that they stand up, and that makes it harder to make these countries reform, because in order to properly achieve these economic policies, you have to have good governance when you go to China, and when China doesn't have anything against the US. Yes, please.
Unless you use Western ideologies to change the social concepts and politics inside the country, even if these countries get richer, it will only be the dictators who will actually problem.
We don't think that's true because, well, the US is kind of a hypocrite when it comes to things like the moral value, the things like human rights. When we look at China, for example, we see let's look at the US how it treats poor immigrants who are unable to cope with financial stability. We think that even if China is assuming that it's an evil actor and doesn't necessarily treat people nicely, it doesn't morally say that it's someone who's a good guy out there. China isn't a hypocrite with the policies that it tries to implement. It isn't trying to be like the West. That's why my second issue is about what is the best interest for these South African countries. We think that when you have economic policies that are already failing in the first world, we think it's particularly hard to try and contextualize it in the case of the third world. Because in a first world context, when the resources are always flowing, if you can barely sustain it there, what are the chances of you being able to sustain it with corrupt regimes or with horrible regimes? We think it's much harder to sustain it there, and it's not in the interest of African countries to do so. But well, in some case, at the end of the day, if we look at the debate, it is particularly because of the US we have so many conflicts. We think, like the example pointed out by Ellery when he told us that it is partly because of the US that North Korea is afraid. We think that it is because they were afraid of the US that they threatened to declare war against South Korea thrice. And we think it is particularly because of China that they have readily engaged in the table. Remember, Bush labeled North Korea as the axis of evil. And that's the particular thing you're supporting when you allow them to engage in South African countries that hate them. At the end of this debate, closing opposition wins. Thank you.